Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to discuss in this section is the Cherokee, Confucian familialism, desert farming, and the American family. We're going to continue our discussion on organization and the structure of kinship. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. We're going to talk about those people right there because we're talking about family and the way in which human societies and human cultures self-organize around the structure of kinship. You already have met Robert, you've already met Robert's family, so you know what these anthropological symbols mean, all these triangles and equal signs and circles, because you have to know that when we talk about lineality. Lineality is a type of vertical kinship relation, the relation through time, through generation. And there's many types of lineality. We're only really going to discuss a couple right here. One of the main ones we're going to discuss is the most common type of lineal system, patrilineal descent. You can see it's right there. It's in all caps, so you know it's important. Patrilineal descent is when a human society measures descent through the male line, from father to son. It is by far the most common manner of descent in all human societies. Anglo-American culture is patrilineal, as is the whole of China. Women marry into the group, and the male name is privileged over the female name. Property, names, and titles are handed down from father to son. And you can see in the chart right up ahead, the colored triangles are the pattern of descent through time. Children receive the name of the father. Women either take the name of their husband or do not pass on their, if they do keep their name, they don't pass that name on to their children. Patrilineality, titles, descent, they are measured through the male line. This is contrasted with, of course, matrilineal descent, which measures descent, surprise, through the female line. The female name is usually taken by the children, and inclusion within the group is tracked through one's mothers. You can see in the chart right up above, the shaded areas indicate vertical descent through time, with names and titles and property being handed down from mother to child. It's not always mother to daughter, it's mother to child. Matrilineality is not as common as patrilineal descent, but it occurs quite frequently in different human societies. And generally, in matrilineal society, the most important person in a child's life is not necessarily their biological father, but their MB, their mother's brother. Men generally marry into the group, and the female name is privileged over the male name. Properties, names, titles, so on and so forth, are usually handed down from mother to child, but again, not necessarily mother to daughter, even though that does occur. So let's return to the Cleaver family. And please note the descent of the name Cleaver. It gets passed on from Ward Cleaver Sr. to Ward Cleaver Jr. And then Ward Cleaver Jr., of course, passes the Cleaver name on to his sons, Wally and the Beeve. June was born June Bronson. That was her maiden name. And she took her husband's name when they married. So the Cleaver family, is it an example of a patriline or a matriline? Does it show patrilineal descent or matrilineal descent, and why? Now, here is an actual family. It's not a made-up TV family like the Cleavers are. This is a Quatty's family, and Quatty is a Cherokee woman. And the Cherokee themselves are a Native American group. We'll talk about them in a bit more. They were originally in the southern Appalachian Mountains, but were relocated to Oklahoma in the 19th century. And there's a picture of Quatty's family, and there's Quatty's kinship chart over there on the left. And please note, I want you to look at Quatty's kinship, that the dotted line is her immediate family. She's, of course, in all bold. She's the black circle. But the people in shaded gray, those are the people that share the same last name as Quatty. So look at Quatty, and I want you to look at her family and look at how the names are inherited vertically through time, through the different generations. Is this Cherokee family, is it an example of a patriline or a matriline? Is it patrilineal or matrilineal? Hopefully you can be able to tell, and of course the answer is, of course, the Cherokee are very famously a matrilineal society in which the names and property are inherited from mother to child, not from father to son. And the Cherokee are a very interesting group. The Cherokee themselves are a very large Native American group. They were actually formed in the southern Appalachian Mountains, northern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, eastern Alabama. They were formed in the 16th century from the collapse of various Mississippian groups in the wake of the Columbian contact. and then had to undergo large-scale trauma as their society was essentially ethnically cleansed in the 1830s, as the U.S. government forcibly relocated the Cherokee from northern Georgia to eastern Oklahoma along the very famous and incredibly tragic Trail of Tears. Now, the interesting thing is that the Cherokee went through these big societal shocks. They were originally a sort of union of different traumatized groups that were forming from the wake of all of this disease apocalypse, which spread across Native America in the 16th century. But then they were traumatized a second time by their forcible relocation by the American government. So their society had to go large-scale change. And this is the thing you need to know, and we'll return to the Cherokee in just a tick. But one of the critiques that stuck about traditional study of kinship structures is that it assumed that kinship structures were static through time. And of course, we know now that this is not true. Kinship structures, like any other cultural structures, change through time. As the structure functions differently for different groups of people, it has to meet different needs over time. And of course, one of the key insights on how kinship structures change was the way in which de facto rules become de jure rules. The messy families of today become the idealized families of tomorrow. So even though we think of the Cherokee as famously a matrilineal group, we have to remember that this might not have always been true. Now, there are different types of vertical descent than just matrilineal or patrilineal, and there's actually about an additional 5 or 6, and I'm just going to describe 3 of them real quick. These are called nonlinear or cognatic descent systems, in which you don't trace it through a single line, the fathers or the mothers. You have things like double descent, which measures descent through both the male and female lines, usually depending on which sort of cultural aspect is being addressed at any given moment. Among the Yako people of Nigeria, for instance, you have special groups of matriclans that exist, even though I think parts of the other society are mostly patrilineal. So you've got like 2 different kinds of descent operating at the same time. That matriclans exist between men related through consanguineous maternal ties. Double descent among human systems is extremely rare. In addition to double descent, you have something called ambilineal descent. Now, like with double descent, you have both patrilineal and matrilineal descent groups being present at the same time. A child will inherit the name of both mother and father simultaneously, but generally, upon reaching age, the parents choose which group their children will belong to, either patrilineal or matrilineal. This is extremely rare, and frankly, one of the odder groups in which ambilineal descent is present was among the noble families of Europe, in which generally men and women would marry into these very prestigious aristocratic families. And they would basically simply decide to take the name of whatever side of the family was most prestigious, was wealthier, with a higher status. I mean, gender became almost secondary. Even though Europe was a very patrilineal society, if a lower status man married into a high status noble family, he would actively take the name of his wife and give that very prestigious noble family to his children. That's an example of ambilineal descent. Then there's something called bilateral descent, in which a child is equally related to both paternal and maternal groups. And this is opposed to strongly delineated linear groups. Each child basically maintains a loose network of kin relations called a kindred. This is extremely rare and generally only found among societies that suffer major cultural trauma. Something really bad happened to this society, and basically it destroyed or disturbed existing kin relationships. And so you've got bilateral descent as people just trying to construct families with whatever sort of, consanguineous or affinal relationships are left. In addition to sort of vertical descent, you have sort of a horizontal locality. You have different patterns of locality. Now, locality involves who moves after marriage and what house you actually move into. And there are many forms of affinal locality, but we're basically only going to focus on 3. Patrilocality, and a type of patrilocality is called virilocality. Now, patrilocality is when, after marriage, the wife moves into the household of the husband. Traditional Chinese society is strongly patrilocal. The groom lives in the household of his father. He gets married, and his wife moves into the household of her husband. You can see it in the chart right up above. The area circled in blue is the household. The wife moves into the household of her husband, and daughters move out of the household and into the household of their new grooms. Now, tensions inside patrilocal societies tend to run really high between a wife and her HM, her husband's mother, her mother-in-law. Statistically, patrilocality is the most common system of locality of all human societies. It accounts for roughly 2/3 of all human societies. And indeed, in our sort of globally interconnected world, there is often cultural clashes between Western brides who marry, these attractive Chinese men, and they move into this very traditional Chinese society, expecting it's going to act like Western society, and then find themselves at total loggerheads with their HM. Because in traditional Chinese society, the new bride is subservient and is expected to be submissive to her husband's mother. But these Western brides come from societies where women are expected to be very independent and have their own careers. And there is enormous amount of clash between these new brides and their HMs. I mean, there's whole news stories about this, about these women that marry into the very traditional Chinese families, expecting a really good and warm relationship with their HM, only to find very, very chilly receptions. I mean, look at that photograph on the left. She's all beaming, she's all happy, and mother-in-law is not happy in that photograph. So not happy in that photograph. Now, when you start talking about kinships, when you start talking about patrilocality, patrilocal kinship structures, again, in sort of proper Malinowski fashion, let's actually look at this. What function does this cultural structure serve? How does it meet the needs of the people who employ this cultural structure? And in terms of understanding the strong Chinese tradition of patrilocality, we kind of have to understand a couple things about traditional Chinese society. We have to understand kind of two things really quickly. One is traditional Chinese agriculture, economically how a patrilocal system is supported by the Chinese economy and by Chinese farming. And two, you have to understand kind of the cultural context of Confucian familialism and how life on earth is supposed to mirror orderly life in heaven, this sort of idealized life. So first, let's talk about Chinese agriculture. The Chinese have a highly effective system of agriculture in which they traditionally grow rice south of a certain line and wheat north of that line. The traditional Chinese agriculture consists of these very large farms that are passed on through the male line, patrilineally. And in these large farms, it involves large-scale modification of the land over successive generations. And the main work group working these traditional Chinese farms is a man and his sons and their sons. And this is when I talk about long-term modification of the landscape, look at that picture in the upper left. That terracing of that entire mountainside must have taken generations to do. And some of these farms are incredible. Some of these farms are like thousands of years old. And whether they're growing wheat or rice, traditional Chinese farming consists of considerable long-term capital investments. Literally 5, 10, 100 generations of people investing work in this farm. They are raising terraces, they're building water wheels, they're building fish ponds, they're inheriting iron plows, they're building orchards, and inheriting teams of buffalo to pull those iron plows. The investment required and continues to require multi-generational commitment. When you receive this farm that your family has worked on for, again, in some cases, 1,000 years your family has owned this farm. There's some farms in northern China that have been in the same family literally 3,000 years. You have these ancient documents that gives the family name owning this farm, and it's like your family name. That's the type of long-term multi-generational component commitment we're talking about. And if you're a man in this traditional Chinese family, the cultural expectation is that you are going to inherit this gift from 1,000 generations before you, be a good caretaker, and then pass this on to the 1,000 generations that will come after you. Farms in the North possess like fantastic antiquity. That's what a water wheel looks like, by the way. And that's a modern picture of like a 500-year-old water wheel, which is designed to move water from one reservoir into the field. Now, farms, especially in the North, possess great antiquity. They go back, thousands of years, but the farms are highly, highly productive. I mean, with these farms, they feed the whole of China. The farms are large. They're worked by a patriarch and his son. The farmhouse itself is generally run by the patriarch's wife. And she is in charge of all of these women who have moved into her household and is expected to rule them with an iron rod. Not expecting this crazy Western woman to show up with her own ideas of having a career. These are not people that are moving around on the landscape. These are not people who are expected to sort of move out of their parents' house. They're expected to inherit this gift from their ancestors and then pass it on to their descendants. They are people with a strong cultural expectation to stay in place and intensively cultivate this large single farm. Now, this developed either from or along with or because of these very strong cultural ideas, these strong Confucian ideals of proper familial roles. This is something called Confucian familialism. And it's a way that goes back to Confucian China. It's a way to sort of build proper harmonious family relationships so they don't disturb this really large productive farm. Now, the family, in Confucian familialism, the family is expected to mirror the heavenly order through close adherence to orthodoxy. And Confucian familialism stresses the close relationships between father and son, the duty of children to their elderly parents, and the encouragement of a large family. You're encouraged to have a lot of kids, because the more kids you have, the better you can work the farm, gifted to you by your ancestors, and the worship of those ancestors. And in fact, the principles of Confucian familialism was written by a Confucian scholar named Ban Zhao, and it involves the 3 obediences and the 4 virtues that are expected of women who are marrying into this large family, who marry into their husband's family. The 3 obediences are that a woman is expected to obey her father as a daughter, and that father includes her husband's father, to obey her husband as a wife, and to obey her sons in widowhood. And the 4 virtues are morality, proper speech, modest manner, and diligent work. And a woman follows this, and it ensures an orderly life. She has a harmonious place within the family, and women are expected to follow these 3 obediences and 4 virtues. And in fact, I had a student once who listened to the obediences and virtues of Ban Zhao, and she kind of scoffed, and she's like, yeah, what guy came up with that? And then I had to point out, that is Ban Zhao right above my head. Ban Zhao was a woman, all right, who married into the family of her husband. And you can see how Confucian familialism is almost set up as a guide, as this is how you move into a large household of strangers and have a place within it, and it doesn't cause a lot of problems. And indeed, one of the things that's suggested when Western brides marry these Chinese men and move into their family is the papers, and you have these journalistic stories, and one of the things they recommend is picking up a copy of Ban Zhao, reading it, because this is how you ensure a proper relationship with your in-laws. Now, I want you to think about this. We're going to approach this very structure function, very Malinowski. What function do these cultural structures, do these kinship structures serve to the people of China? How can you use this idea of Confucian familialism and this sort of economic ideas of these big Chinese farms? How can you use these things to explain a strong Chinese tradition of patrilocality? Think about that, write that down in your notes, and come up to an answer with it, because I might ask you that later. And in fact, I probably will. Now let's talk about matrilocality. Just like we have patrilineality and matrilineality, we have patrilocality and matrilocality. Now, matrilocality is fairly uncommon, but it is quite widespread, and basically it accounts for kind of a quarter of known human societies. And if you look at the chart right above my head, that sort of red outline, that is the household. And you'll note that men marry into the household of their wife, and sons and brothers marry out of the household and into adjoining households of their wives. Matrilocality, and another type of matrilocality is called orexolocality, is when the husband moves into the family of the wife. The household is built around a core group of women, a mother, her daughters, and their families. Husbands move into the family they work for and usually possess a high degree of tension with their WF and their WB, their wife's father and their wife's brother. Husbands generally only play a secondary role in the raising of their children, with their mother's brother, their MB, usually playing the more important role. An example of matrilocality can be found with the Hopi people of the American Southwest. The Hopi are traditional dryland farmers who grow corn in what is modern-day Arizona and in New Mexico. And they're in the sort of the center of that map that you can see on the upper left. And right up above me is a modern Hopi farmer. So they're these Native American corn farmers who are trying to grow corn in the desert. I mean, that's the desert. The guy's sitting in the desert. Now, farming in the arid Southwest is necessarily a high-risk endeavor. Cornfields must be widely scattered to avoid localized drought and to take advantage of these sort of dispersed wet lowlands, little box canyons that might be wet, or sort of low-lying, seasonal rivers. Thus, men will not have a single cornfield, but rather they might be farming any of a dozen or so scattered cornfields that are sort of distributed across a wide area, several days' walk from home. Right up above me, those are sort of historical Hopi farmers in the, I think, early 20th century. So men will actually be absent from the home for long periods of time. So imagine sort of a landscape and put a dot on the middle of that landscape. That is the Hopi village. And sort of scattered all around that dot are going to be a dozen different cornfields. And men will leave the home and they'll go from cornfield to cornfield to cornfield, then return home for a few days, and then start the entire cycle all over again. So men are most of the time, the men are not actually home. They're out visiting these cornfields. And they're absent from the home for long periods of time. They're either farming, or generally when they're not farming, they're going to stay home and then they're going to go hunting. And of course, traditionally, the Hopi had no domesticated animals outside of dogs. They didn't have like pigs or chickens or cows or anything like that, not historically. Right up above me is that dot in your sort of imagined landscape. That is a traditional Hopi village, something that they call a pueblo. And as you can see, it's basically these houses sort of so closely stacked one on top of the other that literally going from one house next door doesn't even involve leaving, it's touching the ground at all. You just walk out your door, down a pathway, and you're in your neighbor's living room. And the thing about the Hopi is they have this kind of odd relationship to land, because owning land is completely meaningless. What might be a fertile cornfield one year could be a worthless patch of desert the next. You might have a little box canyon that might be a good wet spot in the landscape for 5 years. And then the year after that, it's a desert again. So these sort of distributed cornfields all around your landscape, these little cornfields are more or less moving all the time. They're orbiting around that central dot, the Hopi village. And at the center of these wide-ranging and shifty fields is the pueblo itself, the Hopi village. And it's the pueblo that itself that's valuable. And because the men are constantly moving from cornfield to cornfield to cornfield, the women stay home and run everything in terms of the pueblo. The house itself is owned and run by a core group of Hopi women. And there's our Hopi women there in the upper left. This leaves the Hopi women at the central home, traditionally forming a close and single, well-knit group of women in this huge structure made of adobe brick. So a core group of women is running the household, they're maintaining the structure, they're raising the children, while the men are out farming these sort of distant and scattered cornfields. And they're processing all of this labor-intensive corn. They're grinding it and turning it into something that could be eaten. This core group of women consists of a mother, her daughters, All of these women are going to be sisters and their own daughters. Once the boys become of age, they go with their fathers off to go hunt or go take care of these scattered cornfields. Now, you saw a traditional Hopi village. The Hopi are still more or less organized this way today. And if you see in the picture right there, this is a modern Hopi village. And you can see it bears striking resemblance to these traditional Hopi structures. And the men still work their scattered cornfields. And indeed, oddly, in the 21st century, one of the things that the Hopi have really taken to is long distance trucking. Because they find that their social structure, their kinship structure, lends itself really well to men being gone for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks at a time, because they're sort of already set up to handle long absences from home. And in these modern Hopi villages, in these modern pueblos, the women run everything while the men are away. Now, how does this kinship structure function to meet the needs of the Hopi? Can you use this sort of idea of growing corn in the desert to explain this strong Hopi tradition of matrilocality? Write that question down, cogitate on an answer, and then write an answer down, because it might show up. It depends how the random quiz goes. Now, I want to talk about how kinship structures change over time. And one of the more odder things is there seems to be a pattern in how kinship structures change. And it seems to be that in cultures, that in societies that experience large-scale trauma, matrilineal societies seem somehow resilient to large-scale trauma. When you have these societies and something really terrible happens to this society, like pandemic disease or forcible relocation or war or expulsion or genocide, and a lot of the men are killed, core groups of women seem to be able to preserve the society. And these sort of messy societies, these messy family structures that emerge from this large-scale trauma, those are the sort of de facto family groups that become the de jure groups. And, this is a sort of chicken and egg thing. We don't know if matrilineal or matrilocal societies become more resilient to large-scale trauma, or the fact that large-scale trauma sort of creates and reinforces matrilineal or matrilocal traditions in these societies. But what do you think Malinowski would say? What do you think Malinowski would say? That in these societies that experience brutal, large-scale violence that kills a lot of the men, and it's the women that end up holding the society together. And we see this in a lot of groups that have sustained large-scale trauma. The most famous, of course, being, the Jewish tradition of matrilineality. In the Jewish tradition, you inherit your family name and indeed your Jewish identity from your mother, okay? And in European history, and indeed all the way back to ancient history, antiquity, you have the Jewish people have experienced tremendous displacement, tremendous historical trauma, and this is sort of either reinforced or created, we don't know which, it's reinforced or created these matrilineal traditions, these kinship traditions that can survive losing 90% of the men and keep the group together. And this might actually be one of the reasons why the Cherokee have such a strong matrilineal tradition. That again, the Cherokee themselves formed out of the trauma of contact in the epidemic diseases of the 16th century. And then they proved resilient to survive essentially their ethnic cleansing from northern Georgia and relocation to eastern Oklahoma. They survived that. They survived the Trail of Tears because they could, the matrilineal traditions aren't dependent on keeping most of your men intact. You can lose half your male population, and the core group of women will ensure that the group survives because of the strong connection between women. But again, we don't know if they were matrilineal before their expulsion or the expulsion from Georgia created or reinforced the matrilineal traditions. It remains uncertain at what point the de facto families became the de jure families. We don't know that. This is like sort of the cutting edge of sort of kinship studies, studying how historical events change kinship structures and how these societies have new needs and need new things, and then new structures arise to meet those needs. Now, one of the odder things about Western Europe, and especially America, is we actually have a really unusual locality tradition. That Western European possesses a very, very rare human pattern, something called neolocality. European traditions, especially Western European traditions, are neither patrilocal nor matrilocal. Most of them are neolocal. You can see it there. It's in all caps. Neolocality is when, upon marriage, the wife doesn't move into the household of the husband doesn't move into the household of the wife, but rather husband and wife are expected to move into a new household of their own. And you can see this in the diagram on the upper left. Each of those circles is a new household. In American society, once you come of age, you're expected to move out of your parents' house. In fact, telling someone that they live in their parents' basement is, that's throwing shade on them. That's an insult. Neolocality is when, upon marriage, the husband and the wife move into a new household, one completely separated from either set of parents. Each new household establishes itself as a new nuclear family, as a new conjugal unit. Now, in the United States, American culture has strongly reinforced this. Indeed, American culture has taken the sort of neo-local tradition to extremes that aren't present inside of Europe. Indeed, in parts of Europe, especially Southern Europe, grown men there's nothing unusual with grown men living in the houses of their parents, but once they're married, they're expected to move out. In American society, a grown man living with his parents is looked at very askance. We view that as something weird and strange. Now, again, the cutting edge of kinship studies is looking at how historical events change kinship structures. And indeed, one of the things that's characterized American culture all the way back from when it was formed, Jamestown in 1607, is that the America as a society, America as a group, has always been largely defined by its access to an open frontier. There was always too few people and a lot of space for them to move into. And indeed, I want you to think about this question I'm about to ask you. Cogitate on this and come up with an answer. American society has always had access to wide open spaces. The American society has historically had access to the frontier. So how could you build an argument that could use this constant presence of the frontier? How could the constant presence of this open space explain the strong American tradition, the strong American insistence on a neo-locality? Cogitate on this, write the question down, come up with an answer of your own, and put it in your notes. Now, we're going to move on from this and talk about actual case studies of kinship structures in actual human societies in the next section, and I will see you there.